everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? We can move right past this. I'm going to assume you and the audience are on the same area, let's just say, of the empathetic spectrum, and therefore are probably not feeling wonderful inside, or at the least, you have a gnawing sense of anxiety or despair. Something's gnawing on the inside of your soul. And brother, do I have the solution for you? Why it's today's episode with Roy Montgomery. What an absolute delight. If you don't know who Roy is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from London, guitarist and composer Roy Montgomery grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, and his first band, the Pin Group, was part of the forefront of the New Zealand post-punk scene in the early 1980s. That, along with bands like The Clean and The Chills, centered around Flying Nun Records. After this, he began recording on his own, and he began to draw acclaim by his second solo album, Temple 4, which was released on Cranky. Since then, he has recorded any number of fantastic albums, collaborated with groups like Bardo Pond and Flying Saucer Attack, and become a lecturer and head of the Environmental Management Department at Lincoln University. His most recent work, Camera Melancholia, was released on Grapefruit a few years ago, and like everything else Roy does, it's wonderful. This was a great talk. I really only knew Roy through his music, not really as a person, and we get in deep about his childhood. His dad's from Germany, and you can imagine the timeline about when his dad might have been in Germany. Talk about that, and growing up in New Zealand, and a lot of other things. I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil the chat. Is it better? Is suspense? Should I name one thing we talk about, and then you'll be in suspense until you get there? Very Hitchcock? Or should I just let you listen? Yeah, let's do that. But Roy was very open, and I'm glad we got to talk. I've been a huge fan since my friend Luke introduced me to his albums back in college, back at the radio station, WPTS 92.1 FM. By the way, coming up on the show, a number of really amazing talks with, I talk with the band Tsunami. I talk with Fred Thomas. That was such a good chat. If you don't know Fred's music, he's great. Coming up next week, John Pham, the indie comics artist. He has a new book out on Fantagraphics. Fantagraphics has published his latest book, J&K. It's really good. And we have a very cool talk. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Roy. I'm curious if this is true, but you seem like a balanced person. From reading interviews, from listening to your music, I don't know if that's true or not. Even talking with you now, I don't know. Maybe it's because it's morning where you are.
Balanced? You mean not someone who does well in the musical or creative world, but struggles in the real world? Is that like...
I mean, even more emotionally balanced. Like, you have it under control. Whereas talking with me for 3 minutes before we started, you're just like, oh, this guy's a mess. I mean, you didn't say that, but I'm just saying that in my mind, that's what I'm projecting. Whereas my anxiety, I wear it like a cloak. Whereas it seems like you've got it figured out.
Oh yeah, I guess that's to some extent to do with my day job, which is being an academic and standing in front of students and, pretending that I'm balanced. There's a performative aspect to that, and you don't last very long as a front of house academic if you can't learn those ropes. So that's probably one aspect of it, and then there's just my demeanor, which is probably partly Kiwi, which is to be a little bit understated and low key. That's how we fit in the world. We've got neighbours across the Tasman who are noisier, So I guess we play off that a bit. I mean, that's what comes to mind is because I don't think, you know, I don't have an excuse for not being more balanced because of my age compared to someone like you. So, there's an age aspect to you'd expect someone, hopefully, as they get older and get more experience, they get knocked around by things, but then they start to see some of this as a pattern they can deal with. Whereas when you're 30, it's some of this just hits you and you're still all over the place. And I don't think I was, I probably had more attitude when I was in my 20s, and that sometimes gives the impression of being balanced, like, you've got a position on things. But I don't think I was any more together than anyone else. I just pretended. And there's probably an aspect of that. It's like you have to pretend to yourself that you are on top of things. Well, I find that, for me, I can't wear my emotions on my sleeves except at very extreme times when it gets broken down.
When you say that it's, you're pretending in some sense, is there a lot of daylight between what you're feeling inside and this persona that you have to put on, either whether let's say you're teaching or just, I don't know, talking with someone where you don't want to reveal a lot, let's say. Is there a lot of daylight there, or is it strenuous to have to put on this persona?
It's not strenuous.
Okay. So it's like it's just you. It's you, but just like a facet of you in a sense. Like you're not putting on. It's not a whole different kind of person you have to put on.
No, and I do get reminded by my family and people close to me that I should give a bit more. And when I'm at work, because I'm paid, I do make that effort, but it's not so much strenuous. It's not like I can't be bothered. It's just a lack of self-awareness that you think you're being very direct and open and not intimidating in any kind of way. And then it takes someone else to tell you, like, you look so pissed off. Why? Yep. Don't look so scornful. And I'm going, I'm not scornful. This is just the way I talk and look. It's not. There's nothing heavy going on. So I think I'm reasonably comfortable with that. I do realize that it can be a little bit off-putting for those that don't know me. But if you know me, it goes with the territory, and it's not me trying too hard. It's me reasonably comfortable with who I am.
Yeah.
I think.
Is it an energy management thing at all for you? Because I think about the times when I'm more low key, and it's because I'm putting that energy into something, either like I'm working on something, I'm writing something, and so my energy's going there. No?
No. It's just the factory setting.
Is that manufactured in New Zealand, or is it because you were born in London, right? You lived in Germany for a little while. Does any of that have any bearing on the person you became, or is it all manufactured in New Zealand?
I think it's an admixture of things to do with what you just described, like being from 3 different places, or a number of different places, but living here most of my life. I think so there's part of me that it's still an immigrant or a migrant, because I came as a very young child where I wasn't given notes, or I couldn't read up on what it's like to be in a new country, which on the one hand is very familiar because it's English speaking and predominantly white in the city that I landed in. So nothing ostensibly different. Like, things look the same, but then realizing that if you had the slightest variation in your accent as a small child, other children and other adults were onto you straight away, just, realizing, oh, they look like us, but they're from England, or they look like us and they're from Germany, and they're foreigners and they better fit in pretty quickly. Because there was still a bit of that post-war attitude towards Germans and other nationals, and also because of the labour movement and unionisation of some industries in this country, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, after the war. There were a lot of English trade unionists who got work very easily because there were shortages in certain industries. So there was a definite migration campaign or immigration campaign to get skilled workers and to get lots of people in here to work in the 50s, and that's how my parents met. They were both part of that kind of diaspora, and New Zealand was seen as a very safe place for you to get a job. But what it meant was there was a sudden influx of these troublemakers, like people who stirred up, and they called them pommy stirrers. That was like they did in Australia. So pommy means, it's a kind of slang word for English people, and it just went with pommy whinger or stirrer, or not a threat to national security, but a nuisance, and could be quite loud-mouthed and vocal in a society where being vocal about things was seen as a bit egotistical, if nothing else, like standing out from the crowd. So I think that I struck the period where there were still quite strong stereotypes about people from other countries, and if you were any other ethnicity, then you got it in spades. People would look at you and may not say anything about you being from Asia or India, but they'd be saying these things behind your back. Whereas I think they felt they could say things to you as someone who looked and sounded English, as if it was just part of your assimilation. So I think, coming back to what was your point about my persona, is I learned very quickly to keep my mouth shut, or not say things that made it seem like I was a special person from another country who was trying to show off, because showing off in this country was then and still is something of a, we call it tall poppy syndrome. Like if someone sticks out, you chop the head off. And I think there's still an aspect of that, and I see how silly it is. I mean, some of it's just silly. It's just, there's nothing really deep to it. It's just a way of kind of leveling people off. I guess I have internalized it to some extent. So I get that when I travel. It's like, are you Kiwis always like this? Like, do you laugh and smile and, do that kind of stuff? Or is that just what Australians do? Or, I think I've seen it in terms of when North Americans talking about the difference between Canadians and US citizens, is some Canadians like to poke fun at Americans, to say, well, yeah, you'd expect them to be louder and more effusive, and Canadians are a bit more understated, and some of it's just that. There's nothing more to it. But
it is,
you can't escape it.
Oh, it's interesting because you have the tall poppy syndrome from where you're growing up, and I have to imagine there's so that's more of like, don't stand out because it's egotistical. But also, I assume from your mom, right? You also get more of a British don't stand out, like be polite, a stiff upper lip, that kind of thing, like keep it down. I don't know if that's true, but
Yeah,
I'm curious.
yeah, I think that's true, and it's complicated by gender roles as well, like women, not being the spokesperson for the household. Now, I grew up in a household where my father wasn't present, so it was just me and my mother. So she had to be very determined and strong, but she did that only, like she raised her voice only when pushed to do so, like in defense of herself or for a principle of some kind, or to defend me. So I have a sense of an English person who wasn't, I think what you're saying is the English are really good at being polite and very bad at being honest about how they feel. So it comes back in sort of back chat, and yeah, it's the source of a lot of British humour. Is I think Bill Bailey has captured that.
Hmm.
He's got this sketch where he says, "There's a saying, not too bad." As when you ask someone how things are going, he says that's so English, and it's like, so what it means is things are almost always very bad, but today it just happens to be not too bad. And he says, like, it's no, you don't go anywhere. You go. He said, use the Australian example. He said, when you ask someone how's it going, they go, oh, it's awesome. It's really good. And you know, yeah, it's raining and the weather's awful, but I'm really enjoying myself. Whereas the English would go, oh, it's pretty dreary, and like, but you can't complain, and it's that can't complain sort of trope. I think that yeah, it's a mark of how the English have dealt with things. It's like the stiff upper lip side of things as well. It's like not being rattled. Rudyard Kipling stuff.
Yeah. Because one of the things I'm curious about in a lot of guests is if you grow up in an environment where you're taught either at home or by the place you live in, by the atmosphere, to not stand out for whatever reason, how does the creative impulse develop? Right? Because in order to want to make art in public, whatever, in your case, music, right? There has to be something that overcomes the geist, what you are growing up in. And I'm kind of curious, maybe that's a little too broad to answer, but
I think the common denominator across, I can only speak for the cultures that I've either grown up in or I do interact with. I'm not saying this is a generalization, but it seems to me that some forms of art depend on resistance of some kind, like feeling you're pushing against something. And one of the things that characterize the society in this country that I grew up in when I was a child, right through into the 1970s and even in the 1980s, was the view of art and creative things beyond kind of popular entertainment was it was really anti-intellectual. So, heroes in our societies were war heroes, sporting heroes, and media people. That was politicians they could be, before the days when we were really skeptical of all politicians, they could be hero figures, but they wouldn't be, the their virtues would be talked about in terms of service they'd given in a public way, being part of a team of some kind. A team spirit, is a really important principle here still. So being in the arts seemed like an indulgence and a luxury in a very pragmatic society. So I think that can do quite a lot of harm, but it also really sharpens the tools in the minds of those people that don't fit the mold. And I think I fell into that category. It was like, it was no point in me trying to be a sporting hero or, a mountain man, because of my physique is just, they'd laugh at me trying. So
Mm.
I'm not going to go down that road. But I will. I just loved music so much that even if I was only ever going to be a fan, I didn't mind standing out in terms of not liking all of the things that everybody liked and finding my own way. So I was very, very comfortable in learning and listening about music, and I mean learning through listening, not through musical training or anything like that. I had absolutely no hesitation in just going down the rabbit holes of music that I liked, and not worrying at all about what the mainstream was about. And eventually, I think that paid off in terms of getting a bit older and going, well, maybe I can do something to make music rather than just to keep accumulating all this interesting stuff. And you know, I, I guess people often think they have, if it's going to be music that's not like classical music, they don't, and they're not folk musicians, they think, oh, I've got to be in a band. That's my,
Mm-hmm.
like, what do? I want to play electric guitar. So, well, I can't just play electric guitar on my own. Got to be in a band. And I think I went briefly through that phase, but got enough of a sense that I might be able to write something and create something myself and not worry too much about it, whether it was going to be art, but just feel like, okay, I'm expressing myself in a different kind of way. Maybe it'll last, maybe it won't, but I don't need anybody else to give me approval.
Yeah.
I think, and I think that must happen across all cultures in some ways. You've got to have that sense of you're not quite belonging, but not being contrarian.
Do you think that was a self-confidence thing in your case, or was it a I'm supposed to do this thing? What I mean by that is, if I want to play music, I got to be in a band. Was that a I don't feel comfortable being on my own doing this for whatever reason, or it didn't even enter your mind because you're just like, well, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be in a band. It's, whatever. It's the 1970s. It's, Led Zeppelin, whatever. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think there was an element of that, like that, because I had pretensions of being in a band, from the age of 11 or 12 onwards. So fat chance of anybody going, well, the audiences are going to love you, because it just looked too childish and too immature. So I think I was very much within the mainstream of popular culture as well. I grew up on the bands, and I didn't come through a different tradition of, say, folk and blues and individuals. That was more or less incidental. If I liked an artist like Bowie, uh, it was because they still belonged in the rock ensemble world and they would play with bands and things like that. I wasn't intensely listening to singer-songwriter things. So,
Right.
Black Sabbath was my reference point when I was about 10 or 11. So if they'd rung me up and said, "Oh, we need a trainee guitarist," I'd have gone, absolutely, because that would have seemed normal. It's a long-winded way of answering your question. Yes, I think it was a normal thing to think about. Just that's the way you do it.
Yeah. I don't ask that because for myself, I think I produce very good writing at the very least on my own. But there's this little part of me that's always feeling, maybe you're not good. And so writing with someone else, sometimes my wife and I will work on a script together, or I'll work on a script with a friend or something like that. I'm just like, well, you're filling in the gaps in whatever my brain is telling me I can't do. And so I have to work with this person. And then I just write something on my own and it's good. But like in those moments of just, not having any kind of self-confidence. That's why I asked that, because I was like, oh, I wonder if this is just a, and because when you start out making things, unless you are really self-possessed, whatever things are, right? Whatever kind of art someone makes, unless you're really self-possessed, you do what you think you're supposed to, right? You do, like, if you are making music and you're in this paradigm, right? Like you said, not a singer-songwriter or something like that. Well, then the natural thing is a band, right? So that's why I was curious.
Yeah, and I think there are different elements that you bring to playing music and collaborating with people that you aren't aware of whether you're ever going to develop any further. Because I was just thinking back to when I was first in the Pin group, or the precursors to that, where it was, I was very keen on developing a guitar sound, and certainly not interested in singing, and I didn't think of myself as capable of writing words. So I was quite happy if someone said, I've got words or I'll sing. It was like, perfect, because for now, that's all it needs. And, no way could I do anything on my own. So I was very dependent on working with others. And it's not like I've ever gone, thanks very much. That was like my training wheels, and I don't need to be with other people. It's just the nature of the type of guitar sound that I have explored. I think that it's made it easier for me to work on my own and then add things to make them into more than soundscapes if I want to, like songs and with lyrics. But if I collaborate with people, I am reminded, it's like, this is how this works, because they really they've got a lot more than just, adding a harmony. And if I was not raising a family and having to hold down a full-time job, I'd probably do more of that, thinking about the sort of thing you were talking about, where it's like, have I got a limit where I do need someone else to come and add something or look at it from a different perspective? And if I don't, it's just going to sit at a level of, it's okay, but it's not great. And I think that'll be something I can't ever change that. I'm not in a position to spend so much time with other people, working on their arrangements or my arrangements. So it remains a little bit of an unknown, but I never regret collaborations.
It feels like it comes from at least a point of confidence for you, though, where it's not that necessarily like, well, this composition is lacking something that this person can add, but more that this is what this is, and maybe they have a different facet, or a different take or whatever.
I haven't really been, except when I was a lot younger and I was talking about thinking, there's no way I can write words. So if it's going to be songs that people recognize as songs, then I need to be with other people. But I've just been fortunate, I think, that having found a way of expressing myself, if I feel something needs to come out, then I'm quite confident with, going deeply into it and being pretty sure that I'll come out of it with something that I would be happy with being released. I just know that that'll work, and that's so far that well hasn't dried up.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about how this feeling or impulse, or however you want to describe it, developed in you. So your mom and you, is it just the two of you, moved to Christchurch in the mid 60s?
Mm-hmm.
How old were you at the time?
I was just about to turn 5 when we landed, a few months later. So I started school here. So preschool was in Germany, and starting my primary school education from the age of 5 was here. So everything from there onwards was based here.
Do you have any memories of Germany, or is it just kind of maybe flashes now?
No. have very strong memories of living there. I think because the contrast was so strong, and not so much in like appearances, but at home in Germany, we spoke German
Mm.
and just little things about dress and yeah, places. I mean, I have so many strong memories of being in places, being on the ship, traveling because it was a 5 week journey.
Wait, like a
So
steamer, kind of from Germany all the way
passenger
to
ship, yeah.
like that's
So
that's
that's a
real. That's almost like early 20th century kind of
yeah, no,
travel.
it does. Yeah, thanks. It dates me. Um, the
this
but
is
it
the
was
60s,
yeah,
just for the listener.
and you could fly, but it was bloody expensive. So most people who, especially to families, they would travel as a family unit on by sea, and there wasn't any other way, no other shortcut. And I think that actually puts a book, puts a hard border in between your experience. Even I think I was talking to my aunt about it, and she emigrated when she was about 19, 20. And for her, that was like a big before and after thing as well, because the what happened on the boat became her so much her life and an adjustment and an assimilation that it's like three different phases of your life. And I think that even with you when you're very small, some of that still rubs off. It's like you're being taken from what you know, the only thing you know, to something new, and then to something new again. And I think you're probably still trying to hang on to the things that were more comforting to you. So being on a ship is quite a weird thing if if you're not being weighted on hand and foot and paying vast amounts of money to catch contagious illnesses in a cooped up quarantine vessel, which is now how I see it. It's like I probably would be a little bit cautious about it, about being committed to being on a floating
Yeah.
incubator.
Yeah. I wonder what's happened since 2020 that might make you a little more wary of
Yeah,
being
yeah.
cooped up.
But even looking at it, when you look at the luxury liners and you think, well, they're still jamming them in there. It's like, your sense of space is really tested. And I think that was probably just an odd, almost like an experiment, being coming from a very populated Europe. So, I lived in Cologne, which is a very cosmopolitan city even back then. That was highly populated. To a slightly eerie ocean going thing with a big expanse of nothing, and then it wasn't seething with passengers. It was a small scale passenger ship, but then coming to somewhere that was like a lot quieter as well. Again, I think that's how if I'd gone from Cologne to Tokyo, it would have been, the memories would have got jumbled up very quickly. But I was able to recall things from Germany, and I know that they're not interchangeable. So if I can remember them, they're definitely from that time.
Did the hustle and
Yeah.
bustle of Cologne stay with you, or do you think you adapted pretty quickly? Because I live in Los Angeles now, and Los Angeles is, for it supposedly being a major city, is basically just a sleepy suburb. And I'm lived in New York for a long time. I'm from the East Coast, and the East Coast fits me existentially. Like New York really fit me, and I find myself at odds with the vibe of the town, the vibe of Los Angeles. And I think it's because I was set up in a certain way on the East Coast. And I'm curious if that was the same for you, or if, being at the age of 5, you were malleable enough that you could kind of sink into Christchurch.
Yeah, I think it probably is a little bit more of that. So it wasn't the city that I live in here had a downtown, had a busy city center. So at the time it looked hustling and bustling. It just wasn't high rise, but it was busy streets in the city. So I think I didn't. It wasn't a tension in that sense. It wasn't like I was perplexed going from living in a 4-story apartment, which is where I lived in Cologne, to suburbia or on the edges of the city. I guess it felt I had more, the good thing was that in a neighborhood, as a kid, you had more room. You played with children on the streets rather than being cooped up in apartments. So that was definitely, the in terms of adjusting, it was like, oh, well, that's really good. I like that, having a river nearby that you can go to and not be yearning for space away from adults and things like that, because we could just hang out on the streets and in parks and things nearby. You didn't need permission or have to go through, you know, any kind of gates to get to anything outdoors. But I think the biggest contrast was the sense of, well, what lies beyond the city. So, like Cologne and Christchurch, not so different in terms of feeling like you're doing the same things. You're getting on buses, you're walking down the streets, you're going to
I
movies
see.
and those
I
kinds of
see.
things. So it seemed cityish enough, but it's like what lies beyond the borders of the city. And I knew nothing of that in Germany. We never went anywhere, and I can't remember anything of rural Germany at all. That just didn't exist in the Ruhr district of Cologne and Duisburg and those kinds of things. It was all industry and transport. But I think the thing that really struck me when I was a child here, growing up with a parent who didn't drive. So my mother had no driver's license, and she had to work to support me. So it meant virtually no holidays. It was, so we didn't vacation. And if nothing else, working class people here, did the 2 weeks or 3 weeks or annual holiday or vacation. So I'd hear about these places that the kids in the street were going to, or my friends were going to, but I didn't go with them, and they disappear to a sort of coastal town or something like that for 2 weeks, Christmas and New Year, because it's hot summer here at that time. And then they'd come back talking about things, but it would be like an unknown continent to me. So it wasn't until I went on a couple of school trips when I was 10 or 11, where we went on a bus tour across the South Island, and I realized, this is what the rest of the country's like. And that really, I think, affected me very deeply, because I felt like I'd missed out on something. And as soon as I was able to get a driver's license and a car, I was gone. And I think that has left such a huge mark on me, like being tightly almost wound up like a spring, and then going from hearing what my friends were saying about where they'd went and what they did on their holidays to exploring, and without parental supervision. It was not like, it was much more a solo or going with friends to explore. And that's still probably the thing that I identify with most with being here. It's like thinking about if I was to move and to go to Europe or to live, I'd find that would be a struggle for me, because I'm so deeply attached to the land.
Before that trip, when you were, I think you said 10, were you curious about what was outside? Like when a friend told you about their trip, were you just like, or did you think about, oh, that would be interesting?
I think I just had this sort of kid's envy of it, like it wasn't, it was just,
I get you.
You don't, stop telling me about water skiing and things like that, because I can't do it. So, and then they weren't being mean. They were just, it was like what happened on their holidays. But I couldn't really do much with it at the time. I just had to sort of wait, I think, and tell myself that that I had the independent mind, but not the means.
Right. Because I always think about this kind of stuff. What are the precursors where you want to not just travel, but also travel for your art, right? Because you not only to travel and then turn that into art, but also, you would tour as a musician. You would go places and play places. My wife is a stand-up, but she really hates the road. So she really doesn't, she'll go and do stand-up at certain clubs sometimes once in a while, but she'd rather just do it here in Los Angeles and then yeah, and just not like she hates the travel part of it.
Yeah, and I understand that fully. I travel to meet people and to see places. It's not that I don't like being amongst other people and meeting new people. I do enjoy that, but I don't tour for the kick of playing. It's just not me, because it's too partial a sound. It's very rudimentary, and the things I record tend to be quite layered. So
I get it.
it's that imperfection that bugs me, and it always has. Like, it goes back to when I was in a band, and you could say, "Well, it's all right. Don't worry about the imperfections because you're in a band, and it's all about the overall sound, not about your obsession about whether your guitar sounds good enough or big enough or something like that." But yeah, I'm not a great fan of live recordings of
I get you.
things, and I never have been. So it just dogs you later on it's not even stage fright or the hassle of traveling. It's just doing all this stuff to then sit on stage and not be particularly lost in your own work and the people around you. I'm just too conscious of all the things that aren't right.
Yes, I get that. Is it a control thing, or is it there's something in my head and I want to make that thing manifest, and if it isn't at least asymptotically approaching what is in my head, what's the point?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. There's an element of me being a bit of a control freak as well, but I've seen people who are way worse in that sense, like fussy about sound and acoustics and those kinds of things. And it's not that. It's not, I'm right and everything else is wrong. It's more that I can't quite get it out in the way that does it justice. And if I can get it out through recording, then what am I doing sitting on stage doing a half-assed version of this? Like who's coming off best, when for argument's sake, the music's accessible in another form. It's documented, it's recorded, and I'm happy with it. So that's always been a struggle, and it was an issue when I was in a band, because people would say, we've had an offer to play here or there, and it's like, really? Okay, no, I don't want to do it. I'd rather be in the studio.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things that could go wrong in a live setting. And if you have a very particular thing you want to express and you can't control every, and I don't mean control in a control issue way, but I mean, there's just like, whatever. I remember when I was in a band, there was a show I did where the placement of the monitors in the room made it impossible. We had some elements, some like keyboard drums going through the monitors, but they were placed facing out so that the sound of it would go to the end of the auditorium and then come back to us a second later. So we were totally off, and we tried asking the sound person if we could move it, and they just said no, and just tried to, and we just muddled through it. But that to me, that is emblematic of what could happen in that thing, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, I think I've got an extra challenge, I suppose, is a nice way of putting it, in that, like, my technique is very limited. I'm not a dexterous guitarist. I'm not a great singer. So it takes quite a lot for me to get the right take and the right version. There's, I don't noodle around. I'm not a noodler.
Mm,
Even if it sounds like some of the stuff is a bit noodly on finished recordings, but I work really hard to get, I have to work very hard to get what some people could do in their sleep. So
hmm.
when I'm on stage, there's a very high probability that I will make errors, and
Uh,
my music is not the kind of improv, freeform things where nothing's an error. Like I definitely create things to sound a certain way, and it takes a lot for me to play it properly. It's not that I have to do a million takes to get a recording right. But I have to work on things, then do the recordings, and give everything to that. And I can't just, it's not the sort of thing that just sits there as a plug in and play and do one of your numbers. And that's another problem as well. I've got no real interest in repeating myself,
yeah.
so that makes it hard because there's no. I move from one project to the next, and the tunings are different.
Hmm.
Um, so it would be, if it was a paying job, I would treat it differently because you'd have to.
Right.
But because it's like, no, this is what I like to do or need to do creatively, I can be in my own world for that process. But it's an awful prospect to try and drag, bits of all those previous projects around me later on. So I've just got nothing in the way of real repertoire, and
Uh,
it's the last thing that I worked on, and maybe something that I'm trying out, but it doesn't feel like I'm giving people, a polished enough
I get it.
version of things. And it's as simple as that. It's
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
it's not an attitude thing. It's me feeling inadequate, not me feeling like I can't be bothered
Oh.
doing this.
Oh, that's interesting. What brought your family from the UK to Germany in the first place and then from Germany to New Zealand?
Oh, that it's a sort of reverse process in a way. My mother and father were both in the post-war era in their respective countries looking for work. And at that time, like I said, Australia and New Zealand were being marketed in Europe and in the UK as, you know, go and make your fortune or make a much better living than you can make in your own home country. So they both independently, before they knew each other, traveled to this country and met up here and, fell in love and yeah, I don't want to go too deeply into it, but the long and the short of that was my father returned to Germany and said, like, yeah, the work is okay here, but it's not really what I want. I'm going back to Germany. You can come and join me, which my mother decided to do. And then my father flip flopped and went, "Oh, maybe, maybe you should go back.
Okay.
And since you speak English better than me, you go back first. Scope out some places. This time I want this kind of job and advertising or something like that." So my mother and I, so I was two, we went to Adelaide on a boat, um, and to New Zealand again, only to get a telegram basically saying, "Oh, I've changed my mind again. Come back home."
Oh, okay.
So, so we turned around and went back. And then 2, 3 years later, he says the same thing. No, no, I'm really, really determined to make a go of it in New Zealand. You take Roy with you, and get us set up. You've got family there, so you use your connections. I don't have any family. And my mother foolishly thought, okay, one last go. So she came over with me, and then my father turned around and said, actually, I don't think I want to be married and be a dad. In as many words. I mean,
Yeah.
so, and my mother was fed up by this stage, and
Sure.
it was like, I'm not. He said, well, I think I can make it work if you come back. And she just went, no, that,
Understandably.
yeah, you've run out of tokens.
Yeah.
And so that's how she and I ended up here, like a few false starts. And then it's not that my father had no active interest in my upbringing or didn't support me financially. He did. So he was good in that sense, but not present as never really present as a father in the
Mm-hmm.
in the rounder sense of the word. So yeah, that's what put us here and him there.
Did you know him at all? Because it seems like he's kind of an indecisive person.
Well, I knew him quite well through correspondence. He was a good correspondent, like writing, and I met him a few times. We're very different personalities. He was, it's hard to unpick the person from the major kind of historical things that they would have gone through that you can only imagine.
Right.
He was born in the Depression in Germany. Was without ever really talking about it, was in the called up conscripted when he was 18
Hmm.
and couldn't wait to distance himself from all of that experience. So he was hung up more on finding your own way and being a man of the world and not being tied to your roots in any kind of way. So he was, you know, his own man of mystery type, self-invented
Uh huh.
type person, or to other people he might have just seemed like a con man. Someone who was basically using whatever they could use to get them to further themselves without necessarily having a kind of the ideal person that they thought really, because of that I understand totally, and I understand it for all sorts of reasons, especially to do with the war, whether you were German, Jewish,
Uh huh.
where anything fell. If you have that kind of coherent vision of who you want to be and you don't harm people along the way, I don't care whether you change your name or assume an identity or pretend you don't have parents. That has to happen.
Right.
That humanity's like that. It's not a family tree in any coherent sense. It can never be like that. But I think the difference between me and my father was he saw money as the thing to chase, and it was all about getting ahead and talking about money. And I just didn't. It's never really been a thing for me. And maybe that's come from my mother. She was, honest working class, but not obsessed with fame and fortune and getting ahead. So there was a real strong contrast between the two of us
Uh huh.
as father and son.
Uh huh. Because in my mind, I told this story as you were talking about your childhood, where I'm like, oh, well, obviously you become someone who has a particular creative vision because you're pushing against your dad in some way, who is, again, this is such a simple, like, armchair psychology thing, but like I'm like, oh, someone who is malleable and is very much about, I have I'll do what it takes in order to succeed. Whereas you're like, well, no, I have a particular idea in my head that I want to manifest in the world, and that's what's important. But I don't know. You tell me how how accurate / inaccurate that is.
I think the gut feeling that I've had has been, for all the things that would be lost through. I mean, it's not father son necessarily, but through not having two parents, but just having one parent. Like what didn't I experience? I didn't experience fights and tension and abuse and like between spouses or being on the receiving end of anything. So I had a very free
Mm-hmm.
childhood in that sense. And I think my father understood, when he said he wasn't a good father, or he wasn't good father material, I don't think that wasn't a cop out entirely. That wasn't like, I want to run around and womanize and I don't want to be tied down by that. I think he thought of himself as not very good at providing that role,
Mm.
you know, And if he was forced into it, it would be a really kind of stereotyped authoritarian
Uh-huh.
thing. So I think he had and my mother said this, that he probably did have that, at least that level of self-awareness, that it wasn't worth trying to force it just for the sake of being able to say that you were a father and you kept a family together. So I think that space that it gave me is sort of grew independently of thinking about your parents. But in their own ways, both my parents gave me free space,
Yeah.
so I wasn't actually having to push against anything. And for some people, I guess that is that just leads them to, like, it's the proverbial kind of happy parents that just neglect their kids, and then their
Mhm.
kids end up being a mess because their parents just want to be friends with them or are indifferent to them, and they go, but why weren't you there to, like, stop me from falling off these cliffs and things like that? I mean, there was structure there and responsibility, but it was just not in my face. I didn't have that,
Yeah.
you know, someone telling me they expected me to be this way. Neither of my parents did that. And I think my character responded to that in a positive way rather than a helpless way.
Yeah. Yeah, you can kind of see these vectors. You have this feeling of self-awareness that comes from being an immigrant, right? It's like knowing you're other in a sense.
Mm.
And then you also have this space though to kind of discover who you are without having a parental figure or someone in authority place a personality on you. And I can kind of see how those two things play off each other.
I mean, if it's, unless I'm really so self-deluded, I think if that's right. It's a very simple and quite straightforward thing. It's like big chunks of uh, of your experience. It's a bit of a lottery in a sense, but they just happened to fall that way.
Yeah.
That I had, away from one parent in a literal sense, and two parents who were very different in their personalities, but had some sort of strange respect for their child, to say if they think they know what they're doing, then we're okay with that. And I see that as I can't see any other way of how I've developed
Mm-hmm.
the character that I've got. It's like background support, but other than that, it's like, well, if you think that's what's good for you, then do it.
Yeah.
Uh, without any kind of without any, sometimes people say that and that's not what they believe at all, but they're biting their lip or going,
Uh-huh.
they'll find out, and then they'll come back to me and they'll ask for advice. I don't think it was ever like that.
Yeah. Okay, last question then. How was it that music became the vehicle for your creative impulses? I won't say expression necessarily. However you want to define it. Some people, I've gotten pushback a lot of times on the show from some musicians where I say expression, and they're like, "Well, it's not necessarily emotional," and so I'll just say the creative impulse. How did music become the vehicle for that for you?
It's a hard one because there's a part of me that's very analytical, and I say that more as a characteristic without it being a professional or like a virtue or a skill. It's like just an intensity of thinking about things,
Mm-hmm.
and that has, it made things like learning to read and write and to express myself in written form pretty easy. I mean, I have no trouble generating words, like writing in the prose sense or descriptively. Uh, and that suits an analytical mind, like observing things very closely and breaking them down and trying to understand them and puzzling over things. And music, the sort of music that I make doesn't fit that at all. You know, it's not it's not a discipline in the sense that I would have thought my mind would have gravitated towards that. And it's very singular. I'm not a visual artist. It's not like some left and right
Mm.
hemisphere stuff where I just dip into the creative thing and throw paint or notes around. It's a very, very specific thing, and it used to be very amusing traveling in the US in particular in the mid 90s when all the other traveling musicians from New Zealand tended to be visual artists as well. So I'd get asked like,
Hmm.
so what do you paint? As if only Kiwi artists were, like they were polymaths in the creative industries. And I said, I don't paint. Well, what else do you do? Uh, no, I have a proper job, and then I do this in my free time. That's it. I'm sorry if it's not any more exciting to you, but I don't make. I've done theatre and
Hmm.
performance. I can do those kinds of things, but they've never been. I've never seen those as that important. At times they've seemed worth doing, and I've done them in quite depth. I don't do things in a frivolous way, like if I do go into them. So I don't, I knew I was never going to be a painter or an artist in that visual artist in that sense. So why bother?
Hmm.
But music was just this. I guess it was easier to fall into because of the popular enculturation process that took place, and maybe even being in Germany when I was very small, where at first everybody's speaking a weird language, but what was coming on the radio was coming through the Allies because it was occupied Europe still. So you switch on a radio station and it was Elvis and rock and roll. It was basically rock and roll, and that I could relate to. The it was just I had no choice, but it was familiar in the sense that they were speaking my language, and I
Ah.
think that might be an aspect of it. That it was like the doorway was through a very conventional public means, but then I was able to, I guess, fantasize about making that kind of music, and the tools were cheaper.
Hmm.
Like it was not like having to go to art school or music
Right.
school or anything like that. It was just, it was a school of rock and roll.
Uh-huh. You buy a guitar and an amp,
Yeah,
and you just a little upkeep, strings every once in a while.
little literal truth in a sense was my fantasy was to get an electric guitar and an amplifier, and I didn't know whether that was, I certainly didn't think of it as creative. I just thought it was miming
Uh huh.
and mimicking and you know just making a sound that I already knew. I wasn't thinking, I was copying,
Yeah.
and that was fine. That was fine with me. But it's something else stuck,
Yeah.
and I don't know what that is.
Real last question then. What do you think was the moment where you broke from that? Where you broke from the rock and roll fantasy of, I want to be Bowie or whoever, right? And you realize that you could express something more from what was in you.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to have a very esoteric story of an epiphany.
I mean, it's almost never an epiphany. It's almost never on the show.
But I think there must have come a point in my, when I was about 19, 18, 19, playing along to, the first step was to be able to, without knowing anything about music notation and chords and anything like that, was to listen to records that I liked and the guitar sound that I liked. And if I, just told myself if I try really hard, I can get to sound like these very simple, like the Saints was probably one reference point. How can they do that? How can they play so fast and play those power chords and things like that? I must be able to do that. Getting to that point and going, oh, that's what that sounds like. And it was more just like, well, what's next is
Yes.
maybe I can change those three chords so that I have my own thing. Like, do I have any riffs? And I really think it was only as mundane as, like the goofy kid sitting in their bedroom going, hey, there must be other chords. And, if I turn this little knob some way, I'm going to get something different. And there it goes. And,
Yes.
you know, it, I'm sure that's quite normal as well. Like it's a breakthrough in a very marginal sense. It's like that difference between it being someone else's to yours, and you go, yeah, I don't hear that anywhere else. Like somehow I've hit upon you know a sound, and I want more of that. I was like, it's a real narcotic.
Yeah. Yeah. You say mundane, but I don't know how mundane it is. I think it is, I don't know, or at least in the sense of commonplace. I think a lot of people are just like, "Oh yeah, I did it. I made it sound like whatever, the Turtles." Or I did it. Now I'm done. And I think there are certain people who are just like, "Okay, I did that. Well, like you said, what's next?"
Yeah, and that's really, with periods of stopping. It's not that once that happened, I every day looked at the guitar and went, right, got to do some
Right.
stuff. I could go long periods without touching it at all, but the that sense of adventure and curiosity has never gone away. I've been so lucky, yeah, that has been a tool that it's a simple tool, but it's led to a lot of things I never imagined I was capable of creating, like bigger sounds,
Yeah.
things that sounded like movies and not just another song. It was like, wow, that's how they get the epic sound, right? Yep, I'll have more of that. And guess that's how it works as well. Like behind a lot of what looks like very practiced and consciously inspired things, there's a lot of just plain dogged pursuit.
For sure. I love that. Roy, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was fun to chat.
This is an absolute delight. I really appreciate you taking the time.
You're more than welcome.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye, bye, beginnings.